Next year, almost certainly, it will be the Ukrainians who will have the initiative, and we'll see a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so the question is that the Russians, can they hold on to what they've gained? But the bottom line is the Russians are nowhere near being able to impose the kind of political solution that they would like on Ukraine. Taking a village here, taking another square kilometer there, it matters for those people who are sort of tallying this almost like a sporting event on a sort of day by day, week by week basis. But in wider terms, in terms of the capacity to actually bring an end to this war, that suits Moscow. This is not really having any major effect. And as you say, the casualty figures, I think, are the crucial thing, because at the same time as the Russians are burning through personnel, we're also seeing that they're actually having more and more trouble actually recruiting people at home. They're having to offer more and more money, to be blunt. So at some point, the discrepancy between the two will become a real problem.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hanson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London and an expert in Russian politics and global crime. Mark, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Glad to be here.
First of all, I wanted to get your analysis of last week's prisoner swap between Russia and the West. What does it tell us about Vladimir Putin?
I mean, it tells us, firstly, that, of course, he's still interested in negotiating with the West, but on his terms. I think that's a crucial thing to make. Now, from his point of view, he wanted these various people back because they were all, in one way or the other, agents of the Russian state. They were intelligence officers, they were assassins, there was hackers who were doing business for Moscow. And there is this clear element of a sort of code in which you always try and get your guys back home. And why this is particularly noteworthy is because it might mean that he's planning further, more high-profile attacks and operations in Europe, as we've seen with arson attacks and killings and so forth. But it also generally suggests that there is scope for exceedingly pragmatic transactional interactions with Putin.
I mean, Vadim Krasikov, who's this Russian hitman who was being held in prison in Germany, there's a lot of attention on him. Some would say, well, why does Vladimir Putin care so much about just one hitman?
It's not so much about one hitman, because let's face it, Krasikov is unlikely to be taking any more sojourns outside the country, whatever false identity documents they give him. It's rather that if you are expecting people to operate in dangerous situations, and one of the side effects of the fact that so many Russian spies were kicked out of embassies, when they operated, they'd always operated with diplomatic immunity. So if you were caught doing bad stuff, the worst that could really happen is you just kicked out of the country. Now, though, without having to rely on them, they're using so-called illegals, people who are under what's called non-official cover. In other words, they're pretending to be business people or tourists or whatever else. When they get caught, they go to prison. And I think this is the key thing. It's that it's not about Krasikov himself. It's about, for the future generations of Krasikovs, they need to be reassured that if you get caught, don't worry. The motherland will not forget you. One way or the other, no matter how many hostages we have to take, we will get you back.
And does that partly explain the way Putin has reacted to this prisoner swap? I mean, in a similar way to Biden and Harris being on the tarmac, welcoming Evan Gershkovich in Maryland last week, you had Vladimir Putin welcoming Vadim Krasikov, giving him a big hug, making a big play of his return.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the interesting thing is this hasn't actually had massive amounts of coverage in the Russian media. It's not something that they really want to make too big a deal of it, with the exception of a couple of the more sort of tub-thumpingly patriotic tabloids. But the point is, to the audience that matters, in other words, as I say, the next generation of spooks, saboteurs, and assassins, they will absolutely have seen not only that these people were got back, but that they were given a high-profile welcome, and almost certainly that the state will look after them. I'd be surprised if amongst this current batch of spies, we don't have someone else who becomes, I don't know, a parliamentarian, like the assassin who killed Litvinenko in London, or otherwise get some kind of high-profile goodie. It is a way of saying that they will be rewarded as well as saved.
And Putin's tactic of falsely imprisoning foreigners on trumped-up charges, clearly that's something he's been doing for years. Is it a tactic he's been ramping up further in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this. And on the whole, the foreigners, I mean, there's obviously exceptions like Evan Gershkovich, but the foreigners who have been caught, they tend to actually have made some minor transgression of Russian law. But what Putin ensures is that not just a book, but a whole volume of encyclopedias is thrown at him. so that they end up going to prison in very, I think the usual euphemism is austere circumstances. And that makes them that much more of a hostage for negotiation. So, look, we saw in the past, I mean, back in Soviet times, from time to time, there were occasions when individual journalists, tourists, or whatever were grabbed precisely for this purpose. But the scale and the blatant way in which it's being done, that is absolutely new and definitely is being ramped up, which makes it also a key thing to note. And I say this as someone who has been banned from Russia, so it wouldn't apply to me anyway. But nonetheless, it is a dangerous time for Westerners to be heading to Russia.
There was a lot of speculation that this deal originally was intended to include Alexei Navalny being released and returned to presumably Germany. Does the fact that obviously he died a few months back in that Russian prison before this deal could be completed suggest that the Putin simply couldn't have stomached that? The Putin's ego couldn't have stomached seeing his arch opponent released?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because, look, there's no question but that Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. The question is whether it was an actual direct killing, kill this guy now, or whether it was just simply that he was put in conditions in which his body, already weakened by the various poisonings at the hand of Putin's agents, actually just could not survive, and he died of natural causes, but in deeply unnatural circumstances. Now, my suspicion is actually it's the latter. And I think in this case, look, Navalny was probably being dangled as a way of trying to get the West to release Krasikov, because that was clearly Putin's primary objective. Whether he ultimately would have gone ahead with that swap, I don't know. A classic Russian approach is the bait and switch, that you start the negotiations by offering something good to get the other side engaged and excited by the prospect. And then at the last minute you say, no, for whatever reasons, we can't actually also swap Navalny. But I'll tell you what, we can still go ahead with the deal. Or do you want to call the whole thing off and then it's going to be on your head? So, look, I mean, it's very hard to tell. But I suspect that one way or the other, Putin would not have been letting Navalny out again, precisely because of the degree to which Navalny was both dangerous and also had clearly got under Putin's skin.
Does the prisoner swap have any significance for the war in Ukraine, Mark?
It may prove to on a very minor scale, in the sense of the fact that it actually was able to be successfully negotiated was indeed a reminder that you don't actually have to like or trust the other side to be able to make deals which are in a common interest. So on some very small scale, some people are calling it a trust-building exercise. Now, I don't think, unfortunately, that we should be putting too much faith in that. It all depends on what happens now. But the Russians are certainly not giving any sign that they plan to build off this into anything wider. So, look, it could prove someday in the future that the kind of channels of communication which were used to negotiate this could be used for some other purpose. But as I say, no evidence at the moment.
Donald Trump reacted to the deal by implying that it was somehow a bad deal. What is your response to that?
Well, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, any deal that he negotiates is a good deal and any other deal is a bad deal. So we have to understand this. Look, I mean, there is no way of getting around the fact that this is also a political advantage to Joe Biden, which is why presumably Trump is reacting the way he is. And it's also interesting that the Russians did not hold off. It's not like they decided, well, let's see if Trump gets elected, then maybe we can do the deal then to give him an extra little boost. I think it is clear that from their point of view, they, A, have no idea what's going to happen in American politics, like the rest of us, and B, ultimately, they don't entirely trust Trump to actually come through with what he promises. So I think from their point of view, fine, let Biden have the momentary limelight. They just want to get the deal sorted.
I want to come back to US politics and its significance for Vladimir Putin in a moment. But I mean, just to play devil's advocate, and I'm not for one moment suggesting it was a bad deal because, look, here at the Times, Evan Gershkovich is one of our colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. But that you could make an argument that by reaching these kind of prisoner return agreements, you are furthering Putin's business model, as it were, which is that you falsely imprison foreigners on trumped-up charges in return for some very nasty people being released who had been imprisoned legitimately in the West. Is there an argument to be made there?
Yeah, sadly there is. Look, again, like you, I'm delighted for all of these people, especially actually, I would say, including the dissidents, many of whom really were under the Western radar in many ways, who have now been sort of brought out from behind the razor wire. On the other hand, if we look at it rather more bloodlessly in terms of sort of diplomatic and geopolitical strategy, it's not only that it sort of empowers Putin to think that he can get away with bad stuff, it also plays, unfortunately, to his view that when it comes down to it, we in the West are lacking in resolution, that no matter what tough rhetoric we may be saying today, we'll be willing to make a deal tomorrow. And that essentially Russia's secret weapon is its will, is, to put it another way, its ruthlessness. So in this respect, unfortunately, although, as I say, I'm delighted by the deal, but on the other hand, there is a degree to which it does empower Putin, and we have to recognize this. And I think it's a good deal in humanitarian terms, but a bad deal in geopolitical ones.
Let's talk about the US election. How much will Vladimir Putin and his allies in the Kremlin be looking at the election race and be increasingly concerned by Kamala Harris's rising poll numbers?
They clearly are unsettled by that. I mean, I think they did at a certain point feel that the election was in the bag for Trump. And although we shouldn't overplay the degree to which Trump is not Putin's man or anything like that, if we look at his first presidency, or maybe his only presidency, we'll have to wait and see, actually, American policy towards Russia was tougher at the end of it than it had been at any point since 1991. And so there's no real belief in Trump. But on the other hand, Trump is the grand disruptor. And if there's one thing that Russian policy towards the United States and the West in general is, it is about disruption. It is about trying to break apart the bonds of alliance and common sort of purpose, which at the moment supporting the sanctions regime, the continued support for Ukraine, and so forth. But I think there is also a degree to which the Russians, whether it's just they're simply trying to look for a silver lining, but are seeing this as a bit of a win-win. If Trump wins, then we can imagine a certain isolationist turn within American foreign policy, much more Ukraine skeptical, much actually more European skeptical. A good thing for Moscow. On the other hand, if Trump loses, especially if it's a close election race, then there is this assumption that basically there will be a period of massive disruption within the United States. Disruption, which of course the Russians will do everything they can to amplify. Not that they actually have much impact, but nonetheless, they will do their bit. So again, there will be that sense that America will be disrupted, even if Trump loses. So obviously, the Russians are watching this very, very carefully. But from their point of view, they don't necessarily care quite so much about who gets elected president. They care much more about the essential health and functionality of the American system overall. And that really is clearly in a bit of a crisis.
It's a really good point about their modus operandi to spread disruption and division in societies rather than get one particular political outcome. I mean, on that note, we saw a couple of weeks ago the arson attack on the French rail network on the day of the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, and there's been a lot of speculation as to potential Russian involvement. What is your take on that, Mark?
Well, so far, the French security and intelligence services are actually playing down the notion of any Russian involvement. And given the degree to which the Olympics is quite central at the moment to their sense of self-image and so forth, I don't think that they would be going quietly if they did think Moscow's hand was there. But again, I think what's really interesting is clearly the Russians are carrying out this kind of attack. It's very hard to say at the moment whether they were behind this particular one. But the very fact that there is this suspicion, I mean, part of what Putin is trying to do with this campaign is not just simply genuinely disrupt the West and more or less say to the West, you think this war has no real consequences for you, that you can just write a check every month to help the Ukrainians and the war happens somewhere else. Well, no, this war is going to have implications for you, whether it's in terms of unexplained fires in your shopping centers or disrupting your transport network. But the very fact that we're talking about, is this Russia, means we are actually doing precisely what Putin would like. We are building him up as a threat. And this is the terrible dilemma in which we're in. We have to recognize the real threat. We can't pretend that Putin isn't doing these things. But on the other hand, if we see Putin's hand behind everything that happens, then the risk is actually we make him seem far more powerful than he really is. We just have to try and find that middle line between the two.
How will Putin be viewing events on the front line in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, Russia have made incremental gains. throughout their summer offensive, but maybe not to the extent that they would have hoped earlier in the year, given the issues that Ukraine has had with its own mobilization and also delays in Western military aid. And the Russian casualty rate is still extremely high. How will he be viewing the situation?
And obviously, it's very difficult to try and kind of crawl into the dark recesses of Putin's own perceptions, especially because we don't really know just how honest and accurate the reporting that he's getting from his own people is. But generally speaking, I mean, what is clear is that, yes, the Russians have made advances through the year and continue to make advances and probably will continue. But then that was always going to be the case. This was always going to be the year when, in some ways, the Russians had the whip hand. They had more personnel to throw in. They had more artillery ammunition to be able to use. And the Ukrainians didn't yet have, for example, the F-16 fighters, which are just now beginning to come into service and so forth. So the issue is exactly not were they going to make advances, but were they going to make sufficient advances? And I think when it comes down to it, I think that there will be a degree of dissatisfaction. Pleasure that they have made further moves. They certainly are closing in on this key city or town of Chasiv Yar, but dissatisfaction that they haven't done enough, because next year almost certainly it will be the Ukrainians who will have the initiative, and we'll see a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so the question is that the Russians, can they hold on to what they've gained? But the bottom line is the Russians are nowhere near being able to impose the kind of political solution that they would like on Ukraine. Taking a village here, taking another square kilometer there, it matters for those people who are sort of tallying this almost like a sporting event on a sort of day by day, week by week basis. But in wider terms, in terms of the capacity to actually bring an end to this war, that suits Moscow. This is not really having any major effect. And as you say, the casualty figures, I think, are the crucial thing, because at the same time as the Russians are burning through personnel, we're also seeing that they're actually having more and more trouble actually recruiting people at home. They're having to offer more and more money, to be blunt. So at some point, the discrepancy between the two will become a real problem.
And just on that, Mark, just finally, do you think Putin is prepared to go to more extreme lengths when it comes to mobilization?
It's interesting that he has held back from the politically problematic sort of options, which are either another mobilization wave, and we saw just how disruptive the first one was, where for every soldier he managed to get to the front lines, 2 to 3 Russians fled the country, or else using conscripts. I mean, up to now, he's held back from using these 18 to 21-year-olds doing their national service, because, again, he knows that would have a massive impact on the home front. So these are options that are at his disposal, absolutely. The thing is, for now, it's almost too late for this year. Because even if he calls a mobilization wave tomorrow, it will take probably 6 to 8 weeks before the soldiers could potentially be available for fighting. And by that point, the summer campaigning season is beginning to slightly sort of ramp down. But actually also the political costs get greater over time. And therefore, again, I mean, yes, if he absolutely feels that his back is to the wall, he will turn to these. But I think actually he's also increasingly worried about just how the Russian population will respond if he starts throwing not volunteers, but recruits and raised reservists into the battle.
Mark Galeotti, always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.